Welcome to the Geoeconomics Podcast. I'm your host, Aleksa Burmazovic, and today I'm speaking with Alex Wellman. Alex currently leads the global marketing and communications effort for Estonia's E-residency program. Also, he's worked for E-residency for the past 5 years, previously worked in Washington, D.C., at the House of Representatives, and for various international industry and trade associations. Today's conversation goes into not just Estonia and Estonia's e-residency program, but fundamentally what digital governance means for end users, be they businesses or physical individuals, and how this is going to be developing in the next 10 to 20 years. So I think that the conversation is going to be useful for anybody who's into the software and governance side of things, either from the producing or the consuming side, as it were. So without further ado, here's Alex. And here I am with Alex Wellman. Alex, how are you doing today?
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming onto the podcast. It's my pleasure. So you work with E-Estonia, which in the special economic zones and governance space is known as one of the foremost innovators of digital governance. There's also other countries that have been quite successful with it, Rwanda being one of them, and we can get into that later. But can you tell me sort of how you got into Estonia as a destination to do your work and what your history has been with that?
Sure. So you can tell from my voice that I'm not Estonian. I'm from the United States. I moved here about 5 years ago. And like many people listening to this podcast, I'm interested in digital governance, in competitive governance, for example. And, I just started following what Estonia has been doing. And it's truly incredible if you look at the history of Estonia when they regained their independence in 1991. They set forth on a path that led them to make some good decisions that led us to where we are now, where we have 99% of government services available online, and truly one of the world leaders, like you said, in digital governance.
I mean, that's fascinating to me. The way that Estonia did this, and there's sort of the pun in Estonia being sort of the electronic angle of the word. Estonia was quite early to innovate with this. If I'm not mistaken, it was in the early to mid 2000s that this transition to the digital aspect of governance happened. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think even taking one step a bit further back in the 1990s, Estonia there's one anecdote that Estonia's former president Toomas Ilves likes to discuss, and that's the city of Helsinki, which is just across the Gulf of Finland from Estonia's capital Tallinn, offered Estonia its old telephone exchange, which was an analog telephone exchange. And Estonia said, no, we're not going to take that. We want to go digital first. So they saved up the money and bought their own digital telephone exchange. So that's just one example of how Estonia was able to kind of start fresh, from the beginning when they're rebuilding their government after re-independence, and made some really smart decisions to do that. So one of the first things that came about was actually from the private sector, where they had online banking, and starting in 1996. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure many other places that had fully functioning online banking as early as 1996.
I was born after 1996, so that is a very impressive thing to think about. Another aspect of what you just mentioned is that the Estonians were able to sort of leapfrog the surrounding countries in terms of digital infrastructure and governance, particularly with refusing the analog telephony as you just mentioned. And a really interesting thing about how it is that Estonia is handling its digital governance is sort of this constant innovation and improvement to new levels of service. And one of the things that I saw while preparing for this podcast was the digital Testbed initiative that was being developed in Estonia, being sort of this being the sort of GitHub for the digital governance in Estonia. Could you tell me more about what that is and how it's going to improve Estonia's e-governance services?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Estonia has been innovating, for 25 years in digital governance or longer. And I think the kind of key turning point was in 2002 when they launched the ID card, which provided a secure digital identity to citizens. And then since that, they've added more and more services on the stack. And I guess how the Estonian government would explain it is that it's sort of always been a public-private partnership, right? This been built with digital governance companies and innovators here in Estonia. But, we're reaching the point now where a lot of people ask Estonia, hey, can you teach us how to do this? Or can you do this? But beyond that, Estonia also needs to take its own services to the next level. And maybe a lot of people listening here, especially if they work with selling services to governments or government contracts, understand that there's a big hassle with when you work with the government. You have to do public procurements, you have to do tenders, which can take a lot of time, a lot of effort. So basically, this digital testbed framework wanted to create a sort of hackathon at a national level. So we're all familiar with hackathons, but they wanted to say you're allowed to kind of treat our country like a giant hackathon. Test your products, and it will be mutually beneficial for us because you get to test your products and services among a population of 1.3 million people that all have digital identities, that are all familiar with using digital government services. And now, we're going to see what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, I mean, several people that I know have used Estonia's e-residency program and have registered their businesses in Estonia. I personally haven't done so, but can you tell me, like, what are some of the reasons why I would do that? Because I'm active, for example, in let me think of a country. I'm active in France. Why would it make sense for me to go to E-Estonia? What is it that that service value is that would lead me to incorporate there?
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned, the digital ID card was launched for citizens and residents of Estonia back in 2002, and since then all these services have been built for Estonian residents and citizens. But then in 2014, the government started to think like a startup. They started to think, wait a minute, we've built all these incredible systems, but we only have 1.3 million sort of customers for them. So they thought, let's actually just issue digital ID cards to people outside of our borders. So the program was launched 6 years ago, and now we have close to 90,000 e-residents from 170 countries around the world. And like you said, the number one sort of use case so far has been the ability to start and run a company in Estonia completely online. So I think for most people, we see kind of two use cases for e-residency. One of them is people who want to reduce bureaucracy. Maybe they live in a Western European country, but maybe, for example, in Germany, it takes a lot of paperwork, a lot of time to visit different offices to set up a company. In Estonia, once you have your digital ID, you can register a company within 8 minutes or even less. And then after that, you can run it much easier using your digital signature. And then we see people from outside of the sort of developed world who want access to a more legitimate business environment, a legal framework, a rule of law based framework for setting up their company and then selling their services to people in the developed world. So those are the two kind of use cases we've seen so far with e-residency.
So, I mean, you mentioned stuff like digital ID cards, digital identity, digital signatures as well. And it seems to me that the centralization of all of this data in the government's hands seems like something that can easily be turned against people, not necessarily by the government, but, I mean, one bad hack and everybody's digital signature is up for grabs, meaning, possibly unprecedented levels of identity theft, and that's part of the reason why I'm quite worried about digital identity of this type. I mean, what is the precaution level necessary, and what is Estonia doing to make sure that this stuff doesn't happen? Because I can only imagine what the what the fallout would be of a breach in data security and privacy as far as the digital identities go.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's actually you mentioned centralization, but it's actually decentralized in quite a few different ways. So for example, all of the government ministries, all the government agencies here in Estonia, they keep their own sort of databases and records. And these are connected through a system called X-Road, which is a data transfer system that allows these different ministries and agencies to speak to one another over this data pathway. And this prevents, for example, if there was a breach, God forbid, if there ever was a breach, for example, maybe you would only receive one part of that data. So maybe you would receive only my driver's license number, or maybe only, something, or my home address or something. So that's kind of one decentralization tool that Estonia uses. Another one is this Ksi Blockchain. It's a public ledger system that this digital ID and digital signature system is built on, meaning that there's transparency built into the system. So if, for example, I can log into the state portal and I can see exactly if any who accessed my records. So I can see if my doctor accessed my medical records. I can see if the police access my records. I can see if the tax authorities access my records. And this kind of also builds in a certain level of trust for people that they know who and when someone accessed their records. And that's all on this Ksi blockchain. So that gives people another level of security.
Right on. So thinking about all the conversations that I've had about using blockchain for governance, for SEZ management, for all sorts of stuff like that. And Estonia is really the only example that I've found of blockchain being 100% integrated into the daily lives of people in a governance context that functions as designed. So what's the future for Estonia's for Estonia's digital infrastructure? Is it going to continue expanding on the existing blockchain infrastructure, or is it going to pursue, other models like expanding itself to international audiences, like maybe franchising the model? I'm thinking of different types of business model and infrastructure that may be put in place for what Estonia is doing. Because as you mentioned, Estonia isn't too large a country. I think you mentioned a number of 1.3 million, and there's only a limited number of digital nomads, I think, that might be interested in something like this. So, if Rwanda was able to create its digital platform through Irembo for itself, I'm thinking maybe it's time for Estonia to franchise this model and start turning governance expertise into an export. Is that something that makes sense at all?
Yeah, exactly. And I think Estonia is doing that already on a certain level. So there's a number of organizations here who do that, one of them being the E-Governance Academy. They're very active in places like Africa and East Asia, places like that. And they do exactly that. They go in and they kind of bring the private sector expertise from Estonia, but also the kind of public sector expertise. And another interesting thing is this X road that I mentioned. This is the data exchange layer that Estonia uses to connect all of its internal systems. That has also now been opened up to external countries, to third countries. So, for example, now Finland is on this X Road network. I think it's actually called XT now, which is a slightly different thing, but basically the same principle. And now Estonia and Finland, for example, are sharing taxation data, different data like that they need in a secure way. We know the Faroe Islands, which is a small country in the North Atlantic. If you're familiar, they're very digitally advanced. They joined this X Road network, and I suspect more and more countries will do that. There's an organization called the Nordic Institute for Interoperability that's based in Helsinki. That's kind of also building on this and adding more countries to this X Road system. So that's one way too. So I think there's two things. Estonia will help other countries develop their own sort of domestic e-governance tools, but it's also very willing to onboard people onto this kind of network of digital countries.
So recently we were actually speaking to a gentleman working on sort of a city operating system in which is going to be included stuff like municipal services and registering your house, just all sorts of local level services that are necessary for the functioning of a city. And now what you mentioned, sort of this national level cooperation, is making me think about the difference between national level policy and local level policy as far as digital implementation goes. So what I'm considering now is how is it that the difference exists between state level tax authorities, regulators, all of these things, and local level stuff like municipal, etc. What's the difference? And does E-Estonia, for example, offer local level services like paying your electric bill and stuff like that? I'm wondering, like, is there an actual difference between these two levels of operation? And if so, how that bridge can be made?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's tough for Estonia because Estonia is quite small, right? 1.3 million people. So, and also Estonia is very, very, let's say, free markets, almost is sort of libertarian leaning in many ways. Just one note I'd like to make here for this audience that might be interesting is that when Estonia was setting up its first prime minister, when they were setting up the tax code and everything like that, and sort of setting up some of the basic economic policy that's underpinned Estonia's growth, someone asked him, well, where did you get these ideas? And he said, oh, I just read this book, Free to Choose by Milton Friedman, and that's how I decided to make these decisions. So that kind of gives you some background. But anyway, going back to your question about local, I think certainly in Estonia, there's a kind of a blur between local and national because Estonia is so small. But certainly I can use my ID card, for example, to interact with local services, talent-based city municipal services, for example. So that's not a problem. It's just about sort of figuring out how to connect those systems together.
Right. That makes sense. So obviously it doesn't make sense for a national level system to inculcate itself with, parking at a local or county level or whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering how how the division is going to happen, and whether or not local governments are going to have subdivisions of the digital space in which they'll be able to innovate locally with their own code, with as it were. We've mentioned previously in the call, with their own test beds, where they themselves will be able to figure out new approaches compared to sort of the national level policy. That's really quite interesting to think about, like what the digital is able to do for governance. But I mean, fundamentally, all of what the governance services are supposed to be doing is physical stuff. It's supposed to be getting you water. It's supposed to provide you with safe parking, ensure property rights. Just all of the basic functions of a government. So now what I'm thinking about is, it's fine that you have a cadastral system that's transparent, or that you have a tax payment system that's streamlined and useful to and easy to use. But what I'm thinking about is, how does the physical enforcement of this interoperate with the digital platform? Because if I'm not respecting somebody's property rights, and that gets, or rather, if I'm infringing on a piece of land that's not my own or something like that, I'm wondering if the cadastral system has interoperability with the police, for example, where the police can access that information and execute on the code, as it were. So I'm just wondering about the physical enforcement of that, which is arranged in the digital realm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I'm not a policing expert, so I can't speak too much to that, but or some of these topics. But what I would say is that one thing that Estonia likes to emphasize is that basically all these things save time for these kind of for these physical activities, like you mentioned. So basically, instead of these officers, police officers, or other government who might need to other government actors who might need to interact in the physical world. Basically, they just have the tools at their fingertips to do this in a more efficient, effective, and quicker way for people. So rather than waiting for some bureaucracy somewhere to file some paperwork and do all that, all these things are much faster. So I think speed is one key thing that that really makes it easier for people to, in the physical world, to kind of see the benefits of these programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And harping on that, what would you say is the largest problem that digital governance runs into when it comes to execution? Like, what's the biggest hurdle that those systems run into?
Yeah, I think it's personally, I think it's legacy issues. So even in Estonia, we're facing that issue now. Estonia is a world leader in this, but as you know, when you build a system in the early 2000s, it's crucial that you continue to innovate and build upon it. Otherwise, it just becomes like the old paper-based systems where it's just a digital PDF instead of an actual digital system. So I think that's one of the key problems. And I think Estonia, this is part of why they launched this digital testbed framework, because we've had 20 years of growth in this digital government system, and it's they want new ideas, fresh ideas of how to improve this. And I think that's something that we're seeing with other countries too. And other countries are going to run into this problem 10, 20 years down the road as well.
I'm running out of questions at this point. I'd like to hear more about what your hopes are for the future of digital governance, and how long you think it's going to last at the level that it's at, and what comes after.
Well, I would kind of just go back to my day job, which is the E-residency program. So as we discussed, Estonia has developed all these e-governance systems for its own citizens and residents, and then now we offer some of them or access to this platform to people abroad. So in Estonia, you can do 99% of government services online. The only two things you can't do are get married and get divorced. And this is not because it's not technically possible. It's just because Estonia doesn't think it would be good to let people get divorced after an argument or something in a
Why is that?
bottle. Well, I think that's just been a decision they've made, right? That it's marriage and divorce is something that people maybe need to put some more thought into. So that's why they personally haven't, at the political level, chosen to make those two services available online. But again, it could be it's just a political decision.
Right. That makes sense. It makes me think about the concept of artificial difficulty, about making things sort of more difficult, with the goal of promoting national level stability and peace, as I'm sure the institution of marriage is one of the pillars of. So I'm thinking about other potential hurdles and difficulties that may need to be imposed politically in order to ensure stability. So what I'm considering now is stuff like tariffs and penalties and stuff like that. So when importing into Estonia, let's assume it's Estonia is in the European Economic Area. Is that right?
It's an EU member, yes.
Okay. So I'm thinking if we're importing into Estonia from, let's say, the Russian Federation or something like that, is the seller from the Russian Federation interacting in any way with the Estonian e-governance system? Like, if I'm doing business with Estonia, is there any moment that I'm having touch points with the e-governance system, as it were?
Well, yeah, of course. If you're if you are selling directly to the Estonian markets and you're importing goods here, for example, one thing is that we see people more slowly. It's growing. More and more people are using Estonia as a sort of import hub, especially from Russia, like you mentioned, because the sort of infrastructure for taking care of the paperwork in terms of the duties and things like that and the import rules is much easier to do. Like you can do it on your own. You can do it with your digital ID card. You don't need to use a lawyer or a third party to kind of handle this for you. So it saves you time and money, especially if you're a small seller, like an e-commerce seller selling something directly to consumers. So that's something where you might interact with the government here, and yeah, we're seeing more and more of that, of course.
That's quite interesting to think about. So when looking at doing business internationally with Estonia and the way that you interact with the e-governance system, what I keep thinking about is that systems like this are essentially going to be ubiquitous worldwide, and it's going to become, as present as the internet. And when I consider that, the first thought that comes to mind is that this is going to become something that's sine qua non for economic functioning as opposed to a unique advantage. And on the Geoeconomics podcast, we're all about geoeconomic advantages, something that is completely unreplicable in the rest of the world. But e-governance seems to be the exact opposite of that. It seems to be something that every country, if they have the requisite know-how and infrastructure, will be able to do efficiently. And I'm thinking now of a world wherein every country has its own Estonian or Rwandan style e-governance system that's fully active. I mean, I myself am a Serbian citizen, and even we have a sort of digital governance system that's quite somewhat efficient at this point. And at a certain point, even the least developed countries in the world are going to gain this technology. So what I'm thinking of is that because this is going to be sort of a prerequisite for any type of economic interaction as opposed to a unique advantage, what do you think comes after the world completely gets unified in using e-governance, and when this becomes sort of the new world standard as far as governance goes? What's the next level of governance service, and how is it that countries will be able to differentiate themselves? Because one of the things I really don't want to happen is for there to be a race to the bottom where everybody's just cutting their tax rates for people trying to shop around for the best option. So what comes after universal digital governance? Is there a new way for a governance service to increase its value add?
That's a great question. I think it goes back to also our discussion about the sort of trust and transparency of Estonia's system. So Estonia will tell you, Estonians will tell you, and the different members of the government will tell you that technology is just a small part of what Estonia is doing. So it's really about the rule of law. It's about the institutions. It's about all of that. I know you mentioned the tax code, for example, but this is another thing that where the e-residency program has been interesting, because Estonia has the number one is number one on the International Tax Competitiveness Index from the US-based Tax Foundation for 5 or 6 years in a row. So it has built a taxation system that is very pro-entrepreneurial friendly. And so, like you said, technology could reach a point where countries are sort of a race to the bottom for that. But I still think there are ways to be innovative in terms of, and I think the listeners of this podcast know, right, especially in the SCZ space, that there are ways to be competitive in terms of your legal framework, your rule of law, and the access to those sorts of institutions. So that's something I would say. Another thing I would say is honestly purely security. So Estonia takes the security of its systems very seriously, and the integrity. So, for example, Estonia has actually built data embassies in one place so far. It's in Luxembourg. So Estonia has a data embassy in Luxembourg, which is a server or multiple servers, which backs up the entire state's e-governance system. So if Estonia, God forbid, were to lose its territory, it actually could have a functioning government still, even exterritorially, because it has this backup on this server in Luxembourg. And Estonia wants to build like four or five more of those around the world, so that actually basically its government could be totally backed up. So that's interesting. That's another kind of key competitive advantage in terms of like keeping something secure for the end user.
Sure, and I mean, what you just mentioned makes me think about the ephemeralization, if you'll pardon the word, of governance, and we're in, Estonia will be a hub out of which people will gain their governance services, like paying their taxes and having their identity and that whole aspect of things. And they may be economically active in Kyrgyzstan. It doesn't even really matter where they are. And that development is something that we'd seen sort of during the early days of COVID, where in April of 2020 in the United Arab Emirates, what essentially happened was that the Emirates were able to change their free zone policy in such a way that workers within their free zones were able to, as physical individuals, keep the tax and regulatory advantages offered them by the zones while moving back to their own jurisdictions of work and working remotely. So assuming that you're a financial worker in the DIFC, or you're a digital worker working in the Dubai media city or the internet city or places like that, what would happen is a lot of guest workers from places like Pakistan and Malaysia would come into the Emirates pre-COVID and work in the zones. And as soon as COVID hit, everybody wanted to go back to their families and take care of things, and they would fly back to Pakistan or Malaysia or wherever it is that they moved from. But they were able to be still taxed as if they were physically active in the zone in the Emirates itself, and have the appropriate identification, tax rates, tax payment systems, just all of the stuff that was already there in the Emirates has now been extended to people working out of Malaysia. So with the advent of the work from home sort of revolution, what do you think is going to happen with regard to sort of these governance services getting ephemeralized and spread out throughout the world? It seems to me like a race to the bottom scenario is one an unpreferable outcome of this, but the other is that these services are going to be significantly improved, where you're going to be offering stuff like financial and pension planning. There's going to be just all sorts of value adds that these digital platforms are going to start offering. And I see no reason why decentralized finance and sort of the blockchain space won't be able to bleed into the new ephemeralized governance system. But what are you thinking of as far as people being able to collect free zone and special economic zone advantages while not even being active, not just in outside the free zone, but outside the country that the free zone is active in? That seems to me like a recipe for either disaster or significantly increased and accelerated innovation. What are your thoughts on that?
There's a lot to unpack here, obviously. One thing I would say, just listening to you, one issue that we face, of course, is that e-residency, or the e-residency program, is that people assume it means a tax residency or something like the automatic personal tax residency, for example. But we know that, according to the current sort of world framework, the OECD framework for taxation, that currently sort of governs these policies in most of the world, that you're a tax resident where you live physically. Right. And so that's something that's really been, blown up in the past year, with people going everywhere, working from anywhere, moving to another country. And, individuals face a lot of issues with that, I think. So that's something where governments are going to need to solve this problem. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to be an issue for them. People don't understand, what their tax obligations are. And, maybe some listeners here don't really care about that. But of course, obviously, governments do care about that a lot. And so one thing I would say is in Estonia is we're thinking about exactly what you mentioned. So how can we actually, serve e-residents or serve other people who come into the e-residency program in the future with things like pensions, like healthcare, all of those things. And a lot of those things are offered more in the physical world now. Some of them are going online with telehealth, telemedicine, and obviously pensions can be offered online. But still, people people pay their local taxes. They expect to receive local services, and in that juxtaposition between online and sort of you living locally and paying your taxes and getting services, that's something that, I don't know, like you said, it could be a recipe for disaster. So I'm not sure about that. One thing I wanted to mention maybe quickly was that Estonia also sees this sort of competitiveness among these digital government providers, other e-residencies, other sort of similar programs, free zones, special economic zones, as something that's inevitable. Basically, we think that maybe another country will be able to offer healthcare, for example, better than Estonia could online, and maybe people will have their healthcare e-residency, in the future. So that's something we definitely expect.
So the modularity of your digital and governance presence in this system is something that I was just about to ask about. So you'd be able to, let's say, pay taxes to Estonia, collect your healthcare, give your healthcare data and collect services from, let's say, China. You'd be able to do your pension planning with the USA. That seems like a really interesting aspect of doing it. However, it would require a unified standardization of all of the services that would belie any given digital identity. So everybody offering digital identities would have to agree on all of the categories of services that get offered. So there's like local stuff like municipal parking, etc. Then there would be healthcare. Then there would be pension planning, payment processing, all that stuff. So with regard to international standardization and homogenization, as it were, of these systems. Is there any movement towards having a unified, ISO type system for digital governance? Is this something that's even being considered?
Well, I think there's a lot of movements in terms of harmonization and standardization and interoperability at the technical level. That's the easy part, right? That's always the easy part. So, for example, within Europe, there's this framework called the eIDAS framework, and basically it's going to require all European countries to develop digital identities and make them interoperable. So, if, for example, I have an Estonian ID, I should be able to, within a certain time frame, register a company in Germany or access some digital service in France or something, for example. So the technical level, that's the easy part. The trickier part comes with the legal framework and the political will for that. For example, if you've been following the news with the OECD proposal to have a global minimum tax. This is something that the Estonian Prime Minister has spoken out against, because Estonia believes its taxation code is actually more efficient. For example, she cited that Estonia collects a much higher rate of corporate taxes as a percentage of its GDP than some of the other countries with higher rates. So these sort of political, and policy-based agreements between countries, that's going to be the difficult part. And even if you look at things like taxation, double taxation agreements, Estonia doesn't have double taxation agreements with big countries like Australia, for example. So these old school way of doing these bilateral double taxation treaties, this really isn't going to cut it in the digital world when we have everyone getting onboarded to these sort of digital governance systems.
So say more about the way that Estonia is sort of driving back against this. What is it that Estonia stands to lose if global minimum corporate tax gets implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too political being in my position, but just citing what the Prime Minister has said, basically is that there is a push to have a global minimum tax. I think it's 15%. Listeners probably know better than me. But basically, Estonia says that they're kind of making an argument that their system, despite having so if listeners don't know, the Estonian corporate tax system works like this. Estonia has a 0% corporate tax for reinvested revenues, meaning that if you put your money back into the company and you don't take a profit or you don't take a dividend, then you don't pay any corporate tax. And then when you do take a profit as a dividend, there's a 20% flat tax. So it's very efficient. And that 20% flat tax is also our income tax and everything. So Estonia, when you calculate taxes in Estonia, it's very, very simple. And so this 0% sort of function of the Estonian corporate tax system, which, by the way, isn't automatically available to e-residents. They're taxed, and their corporate tax is based on where they live and generate value for their company. But for purely for Estonian companies who have a permanent establishment here? It's really easy. In Estonia, actually, like I said, the prime minister has cited that Estonia collects a higher percentage of corporate taxes as a percentage of the GDP than the US, for example. They kind of feel like, we have a more efficient system, we collect taxes at a better rate, we have less loopholes, so we don't feel the need to have this global minimum tax. You guys need to fix your tax system rather than trying to impose this onto us.
I'm reminded of the Gilbert and Sullivan lyric from The Sorcerer. We keep a profit, a very small profit, and he brings us unbounded returns when it comes to reinvesting the reinvesting profits into the company. And that's a great policy to have. It promotes sustainable development in a way that many other ostensibly sustainable policies don't actually do. And with regard to the second part of what you were mentioning, it seems to me like the digital governance aspect of all of this suffers from the eternal human error. And what I'm thinking of is, in Estonia, was there a history of debureaucratization and reduction of human employment in the bureaucratic space? What I mean by that is, were there people who were given severances and just told to leave and no longer be active in the bureaucratic space? And was there a downsizing? Like, how does this affect the human side of things? Because what I imagine eventually happening is there being several I struggle to use the word, but technocrats who are going to be designing policy in a certain way through parliamentary procedure, etc., and then a handful of technicians who are going to be implementing it in code and just maintaining the software and equipment that makes all this stuff happen. But fundamentally, this entire process is about downsizing the human element in the government, thus reducing stuff like corruption, like graft, all that stuff. Is that sort of the direction that the digital governance space is moving?
Well, I think, Estonia being occupied by the Soviet Union for 60 years, obviously when they were rebuilding their government after they regained their independence, they had a long history of sort of big bureaucracies, of course, being a part of the Soviet Union. So I think, maybe it's not directly comparable to countries who didn't undergo that experience. I think, yes, of course, there's been there was an increase in government employment that maybe has pulled back a bit. But I think Estonians would probably say that, the high growth of the private sector here in the really, the sort of all the startups here, for example, companies like Skype, which we're not using now, of course, but was one of the forebears of online communication, was founded here in Estonia. Companies like TransferWise or Wise was founded by Estonians. Pipedrive, all these big startups have come out of this business ecosystem here. So that kind of has offset some of these issues with with downsizing of people. Another thing Estonia likes to talk about is the money that it's saved. So, for example, one commonly cited figure of digital governance is that it saves roughly 2% of GDP. Some of the digitalization saves that amount. And Estonia is, of course, a member of NATO, and NATO requires you to spend 2% of your GDP on defense. And Estonia spends, I think, 2.3% of its GDP, or maybe 2.7 now. So basically, Estonia says, hey, we can actually fund our entire defense budget based on this digitalization, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. I don't think people are too worried about issues with downsizing within the government here. There's other opportunities for these people to find employment, things like that.
In the same way that Estonia directed companies to reinvest their own profits into their own development, thus fostering sustainable development. In the same way, the savings that Estonia has made through the digital governance that they're doing, they've reinvested those savings instead of trying to rent seek or do something like that. They were able to redirect these funds into stuff like defense, and I shouldn't doubt other sustainable development parts of the government as well. So it's really refreshing to see a government that's soberly approaching the way that it reinvests its funds. And just as you mentioned previously, the country itself is thinking as a startup, and the people that left the government have sort of fostered this startup ecosystem that the entire country is built up of. So this discussion may not have focused enough on the theoreticals and zoomed out views of digital governance, and more focused on Estonia as a case study. But I think that the discussion was extremely useful to give everybody some context as to from sort of a post-Soviet background how Estonia was able to, in the mid 90s, have the digital banking system in place, internet banking rather, and how it's been innovating from there to where it is now. So, if you have some closing thoughts or feelings with regard to digital governance and sort of where this entire process is going, I'd love to potentially hear about some books that we can read about this. If there's any upcoming projects or interesting things to look out for.
Yeah, so one thing is this digital test bed that we talked about. I know, like, if there's anyone listening here who's working in the digital governance space, either with their own special economic zone project or something, certainly apply for that. It might be a way to test something. That's a good example. I would definitely look at the resources at the E-Governance Academy. They are kind of the knowledge holder for all of this stuff, and they connect the private sector developers of these systems with the governments around the world. So you can check that out. If anyone's interested in E-residency, there's a paper called the E-Estonia E-residency 2.0 white paper. It was published a few years ago now, but it does have a lot of thoughts about the future of this. It has some more detailed thoughts than we covered here about maybe how Estonia could offer, or other innovative governments could offer things like pensions and healthcare to people who live outside of their borders.
Those sound like some great sources. And if people are trying to find your own thoughts and your own activities, where can they find you on the internet?
Yeah, sure. They can follow me on Twitter or LinkedIn, Twitter at Wellman Alex, or just search me on LinkedIn, Alex Wellman with E-residency. Or I publish on the E-residency blog with a number of other writers. We do keep a quite active blog there about the development of the program. So definitely subscribe to that.
I assume that most of the questions that we discussed today were discussed at length in the blog, and I'd love to read that more and get more acquainted with the digital governance and service aspect of things. Alex, you're welcome back onto the podcast anytime. Are there any other closing thoughts you want to close with?
No, thanks for having me. I would just encourage people to, people in the special economic zone space are, I know, focused on building digital for physical, but let's think about the digital too. Let's think about how to offer these services borderlessly, because that's what we need to all do, and that's the trickier part in my mind. So I'm really excited about that space, and I'm really interested to see the direction of this industry and where it goes in terms of serving people beyond the borders of a nation state or beyond the borders of a special economic zone.
And on that bombshell, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you, guys. You were listening to the Geoeconomics Podcast today. You can find us on Twitter at Geoeconomics Pod. You can find us on Stitcher, Castbox, iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'll see you on the next one.